The sitting is resumed.
Mr. President, order number 2. In the name of the Honourable Leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the National Payment System Amendment Bill 2023.
Senator Cummins.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you very much, Mr. President. I wish to arise on this occasion to move this amendment to the National Payments System Act. This act, as colleagues would recall, was passed through this honourable chamber in 2021, and we are amending in a single section, which is specific to the schedule of the bill, which will treat to the appointment of persons to constitute the membership of the National Payments System Council. Now, I'm going to be even more direct and more to the point than usual because I am battling a cold, and therefore lengthy speeches may not be in my best interest today, so before I break out into coughing. So, Mr. President, the National Payment System, just by way of basic background, when it was passed in 2021, there was an extensive discussion on what it constituted, why a national payment system was being introduced, what was the composition of what was contained within the legislation. And before I go any further, I would wish also to acknowledge for the passage of the debate on this particular item, the presence of a representative of the Barbados Central Bank, Ms. Sadie Dixon, who is here with us today and is available for any queries that may be raised from the floor. We did give an undertaking that on matters of substance of any kind, and even though this is a basic amendment, we would have as many technical representatives as we can make available in the Honourable the Chamber, and today has been no different with either of the items that we have debated during the course of today. Now, Mr. President, as I started to say, this bill, when passed in 2021, spoke to the need for there to be an accommodation in the way in which Barbados structured its payments system to deal with the fact that the evolution of time, the evolution of technology, greater dependence on electronic means of activity, and a cashless, not cash-free society was evolving, and on that basis that there needed to be a modernization of our payment system. It covered a range of parts, Mr. President, and we would have passed that in 2021. What we are here today to deal with, however, Mr. President, is an amendment to the schedule of that legislation and not to the substance of the bill, which seeks to make the following change. In the original legislation, Mr. President, at the schedule in sections 1 and 2, the council was meant to be comprised of 10 members as follows. 3 persons appointed by the minister by instrument in writing in accordance with subparagraph 2. The subparagraph 2 reads as follows. The minister shall appoint 3 persons who appear to the minister to be qualified, experienced, and broadly represent the diversity of the national payment system, including consumers and payment service providers. In addition to that, Mr. President, at paragraph 1, subclause 1B, 2 members on the recommendation of the Central Bank were to be appointed, 1 member on the recommendation of the Financial Services Commission, 1 member on the recommendation of the Barbados Cooperative Credit Unions Limited, 1 member on the recommendation of the Barbados Bankers Association, and 1 member at F who shall have recognized experience in business, finance, economics, or law, and G, finally, 1 member who shall represent the interests of consumers. Mr. President, that legislation is being amended now to read as follows. There will be 5 persons as opposed to 3 nominated by the minister in accordance with subparagraph 2. And subparagraph 2, Mr. President, subsumes what would have been the original paragraph 1, 1F, and G, so that whereas you would have had a separate assignment for persons who are recognized to have experience in business, finance, economics, or law, and to represent the interests of consumers, those 2 persons are now included in the 3 persons that are meant to be appointed by the minister, bringing the total to 5. The members to be appointed by the central bank, 2, remain unchanged. The member to be appointed by recommendation from the Financial Services Commission, that remains unchanged. Same for the Barbados Cooperative Credit Unions Limited, and the same for the Barbados Bankers Association. Those things all remain unchanged, as does the length of the term that they should hold office, which is for a term not exceeding 3 years, Mr. President. That is the simple amendment that is before this honourable chamber, and I wish to beg that this honourable chamber give it its favourable consideration. And with these very, very few words this afternoon, I beg to move that this bill now be read a second time.
Thank you, Senator Cummins. Any speakers? If not, Her Honour Senator Thompson.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I do not plan to detain the chamber, so I really want to make a very, very brief point, and it's this. Another anecdote, sir. Many years ago, my mom insisted that I accompany her down to what was then Barclays Bank. And I remember it so well because I had just not long been fired from the cabinet, sir, so it was 1999. And the teller kept looking at me, the officer with whom we were dealing, the banking officer, with great suspicion and glaring at me because my mother was closing her bank account. And as she saw it, I was there hovering, perhaps waiting to take the funds off the old lady. So she called her manager and it became an issue, and my mother was insistent, and I stood there and I said nothing. Because I was amused, I recognized what their difficulty was. And in the end, my mother asked for a manager's check for all her money, closed the account, and walked across the street to what was then Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce, and handed them the check and said, I want to open a bank account. And they were very pleased that this little unassuming lady who looked like a very ordinary working class Bayesian had a 6-figure account and was happy to open the account for her. Nice to meet you, Ms. Thompson, welcome, and so on and so forth and so on. And the simple reason, sir, was that Barclays had stopped issuing passbooks, which the customers used to take in, and you would have them updated. Initially, they would write in the account balances, and then they went to print in the account balances. But the little old people could stand up at the teller and do their arithmetic and add up, or you would see them alongside before you leave. She ain't got down everything, or they ain't got on this, and so on. And my mother had made the determination that she was not having a bank account at any bank that was not giving her a little passbook that she could see her money. So that is why she ended a long-standing relationship with Barclays and went to First Caribbean. I understand, sir, that the way of the world is to have e-payment systems, and I commend that we are moving to modernize and have a national payment system, and that was the thrust of the 2021 election, because 2021 legislation, because the amendment today is really very simple. Nonetheless, I would wish to caution, sir, that when we make these major transitions, that there is a cohort of the population whom we leave behind because they cannot keep up, embrace, understand, navigate, whatever verb one chooses, the technology. And therefore, it is important, if we are going to have this system, I acknowledge that it lends to safety and security and modernization and efficiency and all the arguments that will be advanced in favor. But for those persons who are not as au fait with the technology, for those persons who do not have computer access, who do not have internet access, who like me it doesn't matter that they have the latest iPhone, use it only to send WhatsApp messages and to make phone calls, do not embrace the full functionality of the powerful unit that is in the palm of your hand, that some attempt has to be made to educate, bring along, inform, embrace, include that cohort of the population that is not, for whatever reason, making the shift to the technology as readily as the younger people. I saw it manifested in really a very simple thing a couple of weeks ago, where I was in a particular place and an argument was being advanced about some of the spectacular work that the government had done, and some of it really was very good. And said, and we have a new line for the public to reach us, particularly young people who are in crisis and so on. And the people in the room said, really, what was the number? And I'm making a number up out of my head, sir. 425 help. And all the young people looked at him and said, but we have smartphones. And what is 425 help? They had no idea, because of course the smartphone doesn't give you both the number and the letter, which the traditional rotary telephone used to do. So there it was that those who had developed the system clearly had a chasm between them and the persons for whom they were developing the system, and the intended beneficiaries were not in a position to benefit simply because the technology, or the persons who developed the system did not really connect with the technology. And while that is the reverse of the point I was making, it still supports the argument that you have to be careful how you put the technology into the marketplace and expect the entire population to embrace it with comfort, because you will not necessarily get the results you are expecting, and you will end up alienating persons. So, sir, that really I was going to make some other points, but I don't think that they are fundamental today. I just want to make that point on behalf of seniors and other persons who will be challenged with this new national payment system and the transition to electronic platforms. And there are people like me, sir, who don't do electronic banking because I want to go into the bank and meet people. I want to talk to people. I want to hear what people are saying about the government. I want to see if people stoop and turn their head when they see me come in as a representative of the Barbados Labour Party, or they turn to you and say, don't mind the talk, when they're doing good here. And you get all of that, and it is a litmus test, or the thermometer that tells you how the people on the ground are feeling. And unless you can find and keep walking and listening to and sniffing the ground, sir, you can disconnect. And I know you are a grown man, sir, not when you are here, of course, but in another iteration of your the breadth of your personality, sir. I know that you are a grown man, that you can disconnect from the very real world and from those whom you are leading. So that is a very brief point I would want to make, again, through an anecdote. And finally, to close on the point that I have seen recently, sir, some very educational mini videos being done by the governor of the central bank and others, Justin Robinson, who may perhaps be on the board. I did not know, sir, that they had embarked on acting careers, but let me commend them for taking what is really very difficult material, weighty material, economic concepts that are deep and lofty that persons normally avoid, or language that we hear used technically in news stories and so, but don't quite appreciate the nuances and the accurate technical meaning, and simplifying them in videos that the average person can really absorb, understand, and appreciate. And that, sir, is my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Her Honor Senator Thompson. Who else? Senator Cummins.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and I want to thank the Honourable Senator for her contribution, which is well noted. I just want to, for the record, point out that the national payment system principally is about the institutions that connect to the central bank and the payment systems in terms of the intermediary banks as well. So the way in which money moves from institution to institution principally, as opposed to the individual transactions, this is really what is covered in the national payment system in principle. So I want to give a couple of examples. Payment instruments, for example, are among the main elements of the national payment system would include payment instruments used to initiate and direct the transfer of funds between the accounts of payers and payees at financial institutions. So if I am moving from one account to the other, what is the back end of that system that allows it to move, that it shows up in the system? Payment infrastructures for transacting and clearing payment instruments, processing and communicating payment information, and transferring the funds between paying and receiving institutions, financial institutions that provide payment accounts, instruments, and services to consumers, market arrangements such as conventions, regulations, contracts for producing, pricing, delivering, and acquiring the various payment instruments and services, and then the various regulatory procedures. So all of the things that we don't necessarily see that go on the back end that allow for financial transactions to take place from bank to bank, credit union to credit union, credit union to bank, institution to institution. Those are the things that would constitute the national payment system. How do we then deposit, for example, a check and then be able to get access to funds within a shorter time frame than if you were doing it all manually? Those are the kinds of things at an institutional level that would now be constituted using technology and electronic platforms to represent the national payment system. So I hope that that helps to clarify the primary thrust of the 2021 legislation. Now, Mr. President, with those few words, I beg to move that this bill be read a second time.
The question is that this bill be read a second time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move that Your Honor do now leave the chair and the Senate dissolves itself into a committee of the whole for further consideration of this bill.
The question is that I do not leave the chair and the Honourable Senate resolve itself in the committee for further consideration of this bill. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it.
The Senate is now in committee.
Clause 1.
Madam Deputy Chair, I beg to move that Clause 1 do now stand part.
The question is that Clause 1 do now stand part. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
Clause 2.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Clause 2 do now stand part.
The question is that Clause 2 do now stand part. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. And those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that you do now report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do now report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
The chairman has reported to me the passing of one bill in committee. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill now be read a third time.
The question is that this bill be read a third time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill do now pass and be cited as the National Payment System Amendment Act 2023.
The question is that this bill do not pass and be cited as the National Payment System Amendment Act 2023. Honourable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Since the ayes have it, this bill is now passed and so cited.
Order number 3, sir. Order number 3. In the name of the Honourable Leader of the Senate, to move the passing of a resolution that Parliament approve the further subscription by the government of 3,522 additional Series C shares of common capital stock of the Latin American Development Bank, Corporación Andina de Fomento, for the value of $50,012,400 in accordance with Section 4A2 of the Latin American Development Bank Act 2015, Act number 24 of 2015, in the terms and conditions as set out in the schedule to the resolution.
Senator Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Now, I believe that the very first thing that we should point out is that the relationship with the entity formerly known as CAF, Latin American Development Bank, has now evolved. The membership of the CAF, as I will call it as I go forward, started out with Barbados, Trinidad, and Jamaica being the only members of the Caribbean region, alongside with many Latin American countries, that constituted the membership of CAF. Mr. President, earlier this year, in recognition of the level of involvement in the affairs and the development of the Caribbean, this institution, CAF, was rebranded, and it now is known as the Latin American Development Bank for Latin America, the Development Bank for Latin America and the Caribbean. It is in recognition of the important role that this institution has been and continues to play in the region's development. I expect also, Mr. President, that over time, they will continue their advocacy to be able to reach out to the other members of the Caribbean region and the Caribbean basin to then constitute its membership as full members of CAF. Now, what is CAF? What have they been doing, Mr. President? They have a number of priority areas, and their priority areas, Mr. President, constitute a couple of key areas for Barbados. And it brings me, as I speak about those things, to make reference to the second part of their rebranding. It is not just the Bank for Latin America and the Caribbean in terms of development, but it is now called the Green Bank for Latin America and the Caribbean. So it is focusing very heavily in its development objectives, Mr. President, on the green transition across the region and across the hemisphere more broadly. And what are their areas of impact and focus? First, Mr. President, water and sanitation, roads, support for small and medium-sized enterprises, and finally, protected areas. But they have an expanded portfolio as well that covers a number of emerging action and impact areas. These include, and I will speak about this during the course of my presentation, the fair energy transition, biodiversity and ecosystems services, resilient territories, inclusive social welfare, physical and digital infrastructure, productivity and internationalization. And then finally, Mr. President, I want to spend just a moment speaking about some of the areas that they have focused on so far in Barbados. Mr. President, we heard in the other place when this bill was presented about the amount of work that is being done. And earlier today, we did cover a Barbados Water Authority bill. No, Mr. President, we have work that is being done by CAF in water infrastructure rehabilitation, It was meant, Mr. President, to undertake a number of things: the drafting of a water and sanitation master plan in Barbados, reviewing the urban drainage master plan, rehabilitation of our pumping stations and drinking water tanks and reservoirs, the replacement of pipelines and the distribution network, and setting up energy generation in pumping stations. And the beneficiaries of these interventions, Mr. President, were expected to extend to over almost 100,000 households across Barbados. This is not insignificant. I have not yet spoken, Mr. President, about the roads work, and I identified roads as one of the areas of action for CAF. And that significant investment from CAF has already been seen in a lot of the roads rehabilitation work that has been ongoing across the country. These are the things, Mr. President, when we talk about buying ordinary shares, it sounds very high level and highbrow and esoteric. Why are you buying shares, and what does this constitute? It constitutes access to capital to be able to do the things that Barbadians need, and in some instances, Barbadians have become accustomed to in terms of our wants, in terms of our standard of living. So CAF, Mr. President, has been a critical partner in those areas. I want to take a moment also to point out that Barbados has been that face globally through our Prime Minister, who has represented the leadership of the global conversation on not just the reform of international financial institutions, but on the climate crisis and its urgency for small and developing states like ours. So what does that mean as it relates to CAF, Mr. President? CAF, as part of the global community, has been a part of the conversation on the reform of the IFIs. How have the international financial institutions with whom we are traditionally working serving and meeting the needs of countries like Barbados? How are their structures set up to facilitate access and terms that are beneficial to our people? How quickly are we able to turn these things around? Are we also able to access not just financing, but financing at terms that are attractive, in addition to technical assistance? We have seen that with CAF. We have seen that not only are we able to access concessional financing through our relationship with CAF, but we've also been able to benefit from the provision of grant resources on the technical assistance platforms to be able to help us to execute on the programs that we are running under the CAF program. But here's the second part of it, Mr. President. Part of that advocacy has also been for the creation of a dedicated, what we call blue-green bank. Earlier this year, perhaps just a few months ago, CAF's presidency and its regional office based in Trinidad came to Barbados to launch its 2023 publication of its priorities and the work which it had done. It took the opportunity then, Mr. President, to announce the rebranding, but it also took the opportunity to commit its support to the creation of a blue-green bank in Barbados and to pledge financial support specifically as well to the Blue-Green Bank in Barbados. They joined others, including the Global Climate Fund, also who have committed, as well as other development and multilateral partners who have also expressed interest. These are the kinds of commitments and partnerships and relationships, Mr. President, that Barbados is developing. I want to use this opportunity to say a few words, about the work that is happening in the energy sector, given that it is one of the important areas for CAF, and to speak about the role to be played and being played by multilaterals like CAF, and why we in the Ministry of Energy see this as an important development. Now, Mr. President, it is no secret to anybody that there has been a surplus, or that I should say, an explosion of interest in the development of solar PV systems in particular. It is no secret to anyone that everyone now in the commercial space, if you drive Barbados, one of the things that's always amusing to see, proudly so, that you see any large-scale business in this country, any large-scale building, and their roof is slathered with solar PV. Equally, in terms of households, in 2021, we launched the Householders' Right to Renewable Energy. So residential households are also able to have access to solar PV. The question here, Mr. President, now ranges to, On what terms do we continue to finance the energy transition, in particular our institutional approaches to the energy transition? And this is where institutions like CAF, the Global Climate Fund, the International Financial Corporation of the World Bank, and others come into the equation. We, along with the local commercial banks and the local credit unions, now have to ensure that lumpy capital enters the market to be able to create access for large investment projects, while at the same time creating concessional terms for intermediary banks to be able to access funds for local and residential households. So what do I mean when I say that? The Barbados National Energy Plan, as many of you know, in 2019, earmarked that we needed 725 megawatts approximately of total capacity on our grid. That's what we had. We earmarked that by 2030, Mr. President, Agenda 2030, the 2030 transition, that we were going to have somewhere in the vicinity of 340 megawatts of solar PV on the grid. We are today, at 2023, at 333 megawatts of solar PV, which is in the pipeline, of which 206 has been approved. So it means, Mr. President, that not only are we, in terms of solar PV, meeting our targets, we are in surplus. Then on the back end of that, there has been a raging conversation around what the grid can actually absorb. And therein lies the second part of the challenge for financial institutions, Mr. President. How do we then finance, one, the expansion of the grid, because this is a privately owned utility, and so the expansion and the investment in the Barbados Light and Power is an important question. Where are we accessing concessional financing in a way that it does not negatively impact on ratepayers? Equally so, Mr. President, for independent power producers, how are we then financing on a concessional basis significant sources of financing at terms that don't make them untenable to ratepayers? Those are some of the issues that we are navigating, Mr. President, as we move towards our 2030 goal. And CAF, as a partner, has been working not just in the areas of roads, not just in the areas of water, but on issues relating to energy and energy transitioning. And we are very much supportive of the work being done by CAF, very much supportive of Barbados expanding its role in terms of the purchase of these additional shares, Mr. President, and therefore very supportive of our ability to then expand our engagement with CAF and with the wider Latin America and Caribbean region on issues that are of impact and of importance to our region and being implemented through an institution such as CAF. And with these, again, few words, Mr. President, because I am beginning to now lose my voice as the AC hits me on my back. I beg to move that this bill now be read a second time.
Thank you, Senator Cummins. Senator Dr. Brathwaite.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I'm indeed pleased to support this initiative, as I believe that a relationship with the Latin American Development Bank is a positive development for our country. I'm happy to see that Barbados is joining the CAF, an institution that has played a pivotal role and a strategic role in developments in many Latin American countries. The bank has been a major instrument of financing for infrastructure development across Latin America. It has been very effective as a development instrument in environment, especially and in infrastructure. Just recently, I noted that the CAF has financed a very important project in Panama, where the Panamanian government is establishing 4.5 hectares of land in protected agriculture, meaning greenhouse technology, undercover, for the production of food in Panama. I hope that the CAF and the relationship that we're establishing will help us to finance agricultural development in Barbados. Agriculture, as you know, I've mentioned several times, in my view, is a sector that is underfinanced in our country. And if we're going to tackle the challenges of food insecurity and the challenges related to chronic non-communicable diseases, it's important that we strengthen the agricultural sector. I hope that in making this arrangement with the CAF, we'll initiate a new chapter in financing for sustainable development in our country. This access to a new source of financing, which is not the World Bank or the IMF, is very important for us as we diversify our sources of development finance and strengthen our relationship with Latin America, which I hope will redound to the benefit of our country, not only in areas such as infrastructure and agriculture, but also in tourism, and will support entrepreneurship and enterprises generally across this country. I therefore take this opportunity to support our initiatives in engaging the CAF and hope that this redounds to the benefit of our country, especially in areas of energy, especially in areas of agriculture, especially in areas related to food security, and strengthens our relationship with Latin America in other strategic areas of development interest. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Bradford. Senator Dr. Monroe Knight.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to support this resolution, which is an extremely important one, and to offer a few words by perhaps taking off from where the Leader of Government Business would have indicated. This is a fundamental question for us about how do we finance development. As a small island development state, tasked to provide, as we've been debating here, what I considered as some of the commons, the goods that our citizen needs, whether that is water, food, shelter. The question is, with limited resources, how do we do that? Access to concessional financing, therefore, Mr. President, is a critical part of that equation for countries like ours. Trying to adjust, trying to mitigate all of the challenges that we are facing in the world that we find ourselves in currently. We keep talking about the challenge of climate change. And sometimes I think that, some of us might get the impression that we're just using this word, climate change, and talking about the impacts either as a scare tactic, either because we just want to keep calling the word, without really fundamentally understanding, as we've been discussing, that any day, Mr. President, it just takes a Category 3 hurricane, and I think, as was said before, we could all be climate refugees, Mr. President. In one day. We just had, over the last couple of days, a heavy downpour of rain. And look at the challenge that has given to us. And I say all of this to say that we have to understand that a government has only a limited number of resources. It is actually well accepted that for SIDS, we do not have the resources nationally. We do not have the resources, we cannot mobilize sufficient resources nationally in order to confront the challenges that we need to be able to face in order to finance the development. So we do that as best as we can, and I know that Barbados sees and wants governments to be able to deliver, but that money has to come from somewhere, Mr. President. And again, like I said, the provision of partners who provide the provision of financing on a concessional base is critical to how we are going to be able to survive in the present context. Mr. President, in the international realm, small island developing states like Barbados in various fora have been promised commitments in terms of the delivery of what we call official development finance. But again, all of the estimates, all of the evidence says to us that that is severely under-delivered by the international system. And that under-delivery means then that we create a deficit. And oftentimes when we look at the debt profile of countries like ours, there are some that would want to suggest that part of it is perhaps mismanagement, we're not doing what it is that we are supposed to. But very often, if we take a critical look, Mr. President, our debt is related to financing, particularly in the case of Barbados, the climate challenge that we've had, the COVID pandemic challenge, Mr. President, that we've had. So our debt is very much tied up in financing the challenges that we are facing that are part of our objective reality. And therefore, partners at the Latin American Development Bank become attractive, and as was said before, because they provide an alternative to the traditional financing partners and a level of flexibility that we need, Mr. President. That is so important. We entered CAF in 2014 with $50 million. And because of how CAF operates, it then allows us to access 4 times the amount that we put in. And we have now almost exhausted that allocation. We have expended, I think, over 260 million, is it, of the funds that are available. And therefore, this resolution will then allow us to have access to greater resources. And importantly, Mr. President, it is the flexibility in how CAF operates that is also important for us. Because you would have many times international financial institutions that would have money that we can perhaps access, but the interest rates are too high. The prior conditions, Mr. President, present a challenge. So that when you find a partner like the Latin American Development Bank that allows you to, one, have budget support in the form of policy-based loans, but also as well sector-wide financing, so that then you can apply and you can have financing that allows you to deal with specific objective problems at the sector level, Mr. President, that is an important partner for Barbados. It is an important partner, Mr. President, for Barbados because the CAF also responds to the direct priorities that have been identified by the government. There are other financial institutions, international financial institutions that don't do that. They establish what they believe are your priorities. They come with their team and they say to you, these are the challenges that you have, and therefore, if you are going to borrow money from us, then these are the things that we are going to say to you that you have to do. Even though sometimes they're not always what it is that we have identified. So that when you have a partner who is able to work with you, particularly at the sector level, again, based on specific priorities, that is a good partner. The other element about this particular partner, Mr. President, is also in the way that it does its procurement. Now, I've worked in the nonprofit sector with a lot of development partners, and I can tell you, Mr. President, sometimes you get the resources easy, but then when you have to spend those resources, Lord have mercy. Because the amount of hoops, the complexity in terms of the procurement and the processes You would have a loan that is expended or money that is available, and 2 or 3 years after, Mr. President, the project or anything can't get up off the ground because you are still doing all the paperwork associated just with procurement, just trying to get the services, the goods and services that are available. So that again, underneath the CAF allows us to use government-established procurement policies that provides us then with the flexibility to move quickly, so that rather than having resources then that we can't expend to address the problem, we are then able within a short period of time to expend the necessary resources. Again, this is why it makes this particular bank a good partner for Barbados. Mr. President, finally, I also want to say that there has to be recognition. I've been saying to people, and I know some people would say I'm a little bit of a fearmonger, that we are in a hostile environment, Mr. President. It's not all hunky-dory for us. This is not the time when we had the European Union doling out money to the region because of colonial ties and history. This is not the same environment that we are living in anymore. If you look globally, you would see again that developing countries, small island developing states, are now being forced into what is called a debt trap. A serious debt trap that we are unable to climb out of, again, because of how the system is designed. And as leader of government business has said, this is why there is a need for an ongoing call for reform of the international financial architecture as a critical plank, so that we have a partner that provides, in many instances, a model that allows us to be able to access the finances that we need in a flexible way, Mr. President, that we need. But we then need to be able to extrapolate that model to other institutions that will allow the government to have the necessary space that it needs in order to operate, in order to deliver the services, in order to be able to respond to citizen needs. And a large part of that, Mr. President, as we go on into the next 10, 15 years, has to do with the fact that we need to be able to respond again to the objective challenges that are going to be emerging in the future. And one of the reasons why this government has been so vociferous in the person of the Prime Minister is because we are not intending to create a model for just today, but for a model, Mr. President, that will then allow us, other governments, generations, to then to be able to operate within a system that is fair and provides all of the necessary wiggle room that is needed, again, for a small island developing state operating within this context. Mr. President, with those few words, I am obliged to you, and as I said, I reiterate again that even as Barbadians sometimes, are a little bit critical and concerned about debt, about loans, that we have to then ask ourselves, one, how do we finance it? And what is the best partners to help us to finance it? And I would suggest, Mr. President, that the Latin American Development Bank is one of those partners that is a good partner for Barbados. I'm obliged.
Thank you, Senator Dr. Monroe Knight. Her Honor, Senator Thompson.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. This will be another not long intervention. It will not be as brief as the last one, but it will not be long. I think that the two presidents the two speakers before me, the two senators before me, really created the platform and natural segue for the comments which I would want and the observations which I would want to make myself. I start, sir, with the fact that I don't know that I'm a fan of policy-based lending, to tell you the truth, but that is the nature of the marketplace, and therefore one finds oneself in the market and one does what one has to. Um, I'll make the point, my second remark would be to make the point that naturally, given somebody who is based in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and my chief principal engagement is international relations and some components of it, one would have to observe the extent to which this bank and the work it is doing, the lending that it is making, based out of Latin America primarily, is significant because it represents part of the geopolitical shifts that we are seeing at the global level. Indeed, sir, if one looked for the multilateral development banks with the largest asset bases, you would see that it is the Islamic Development Bank, the Asian and African Development Banks, the China Development Bank, the Brazilian Development Bank, and so on. So this in itself, without my even elaborating, tells a story. And one would have to hope that with the bulk of the assets for multilateral development banks now residing in the South, that there would be a higher degree of empathy and understanding of the realities of developing countries, and therefore easier. It would become easier to access capital because the understanding of the realities of the framework within which you operate as a small island developing state, and in fact as a developing country, is better understood by the guiding minds and guiding officers of these particular institutions. So I start by making that point and the observation of the geopolitical shifts that we have seen as the basis of power shift from the traditional power brokers, shift from the traditional superpowers into places in the South who were previously the colonized and the minions when it comes to power broking at the international level. So that was my second point. The third point, and my final point on this matter, sir, has to do with the presentation of the issue, perhaps in a more colloquial context or a more local political context than has been broached by the previous two senators. We are increasing our share level, as the leader of government business told us, so that we ourselves can in turn access more capital. Some of the areas for which we have received financial and loan support from the CAF relate to tourism and international transport, ground transport, upgrading of our water and rehabilitation of our water infrastructure, the reforms of our tax administration system, and the necessities of supplies, equipment, and protections in respect of COVID-19. So that this bank has been, or this institution has been financing or helping us to finance our development priorities and our fundamental human and social protections. That said, sir, there is and continues to be a concern expressed in the wider public and fueled by political operatives and their satellites, and in many places, sir, on the air, off the air, in streamed meetings, in public meetings, on street corners, in places where people are gathered, etc., about the level of debt that the country is acquiring. One would get the impression, listening to those who just keep parroting the word debt to create a level of fear, that the country is in deep crisis and that we are accruing debt levels heretofore unseen, and this will create tremendous problems for the country. We are in a position, sir, where all of us, I believe, have had to borrow funds, to get capital, to access financing from a bank or financial institution in order to do development that we want at the personal level. Buy a car, build a house, extend a house, convert from wood to wall, and one could give several other examples. And we have done this through accessing resources that we ourselves did not own, but needed to effect the development that we wanted. Developed countries, similarly, have accessed capital and continue to access capital, albeit at more favorable rates in the marketplace than do developing countries, and indeed than do SIDS. So the idea of debt is not new to us, nor is it new to the national system. And in relation, sir, to the criticism that this administration is racking up debts at an unprecedented level, I think it is important in the context of the conversation that we're having today to share with the public what the position on debt is and was. And I want to frame it, sir, in the context of May 2018 and in the context of September, October 2023. Prior to May of 2018 and up to May of 2018, our pre-BERT debt was 178% of GDP. 178% of GDP. The debt level as it stands today is 115% of GDP. So that when you look at where we were in 2018 and you compare where we are now, you can see that there has been a significant improvement in our debt position despite the money that has been borrowed to carry out development work by the Barbados Labour Party. Another significant feature of that position, sir, is that pre-2018, where the money was being borrowed by the previous administration, you don't know what it went to. We had no buses. The roads were in a horrible state. There were no garbage units. There was no garbage collection. We had raw sewage on the roads, and you could go on and on. Whereas now, you can see the reversals and the beneficial change. You can see where the money has gone. So you can see that money came in for the Water Authority and so on, and you know that we've had a mains replacement program. You know that we've addressed some of the issues. Tanks are being cleaned, reservoirs upgraded and improved, our resilience and capacity built and so on. So you can directly relate the borrowing to national development and improvement. Then, sir, pre-2018, or interest payments. So you have the fundamental, the basic principle, and then you have your interest payment on the loans, or interest payments prior to 2018. And I know, sir, that accounting is your specialization and you would understand these things well. I just did an MBA, sir, and I do not regard myself as any financial specialist, but these numbers are not complicated. Really, people can understand them. Our interest payments as at May 2018, when we came to government, was 68% of GDP. Today, our interest payments, as of September 2023, 35% of GDP. Again, sir, you can see the improvement in the national position. Sir, that's why I said you are a financial expert, and I am not. It was 68% of our revenues, as opposed to, now it is only 35%. The point is, however, that our position has improved considerably. Prior at 2018, sir, the debt of the state-owned enterprises was $500 million. $500 million. Today, the debt of Barbados' state-owned enterprises is $28 million. At May 2018, our total debt position was $1.4 billion. As at September 2023, it is $246 million. So that however you look at it, sir, when you break the numbers down, while the public is being fed a fear-mongering scenario of debt that is an albatross that the country cannot service, the reality is that our debt is significantly lower than it was 5 years ago, and that you can see what any money being borrowed is being utilized to deliver for the public and the citizens of Barbados. This is the critical point, that while we come to this chamber extending our share holdings in order to access greater capital, we are doing so on the basis that we will use the resources to deliver a higher level of development, infrastructural improvement, and upgrading of the country as a whole, and that we will be in a better position therefore. I am giving these figures to the country and hoping that the press will at least give them the same kind of prominence and frequency that they give to the allegations of strangling debt that this Labour Party is, or the false allegations, I should say, that this of strangling debt that is being accrued by this Barbados Labour Party. I think these figures are significant. They are telling. They show how our debt situation has improved, and they show what we have done for the resources that have been made available through accessing them by way of international loan facilities. I trust that persons will take the time to look at and analyze the figures and the numbers and not be so easily led by those who just keep saying debt, debt, debt. When I got so much debt, when I get him more debt, when I'm planning to kill me with debt, which has become the mantra of those who oppose the government and who attempt to raise flags of fear, knowing that many people will stand under it without analyzing whether or not the raising of such a flag is justified. Instead, sir, I raise the accurate figures and hope that the country will stand resolutely with us on the basis of the fact that the financial management of this country is in good hands, has improved considerably, and we are going forward to ensure that the country can be further developed in a sustainable way, and that all Barbadians will experience growth, development, and their share of the Bajan pie. With that, sir, much obliged.
Thank you very much, Your Honor, Senator Thompson. Any other speakers? Senator Cummings.
Mr. Chairman, I wish to thank the speakers who have gone before, the two honourable senators who have spoken before, and with these few words, I beg to move that this resolution do not pass.
The question is that this resolution to approve the further subscription of shares in the Latin American Development Bank, as set out in item number 3, do not pass. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. This resolution is therefore now passed. Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move that we do now adjourn the sitting of the Senate, sign a day.
The question is that the Senate do now adjourn, sign the day. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. This Honourable Senate is therefore now adjourned, sign the day.